papers one after the other, and then if you've got immediate questions, do pop them in the chat, and then we'll have a question session at the end. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, great, lovely. Okay, well, in that case, welcome to Liz, and how and why you teach lessons from learner analytics data.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen if that's okay. Let me go. Is that showing for everybody?
Yes, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you for allowing me to present today. This is work that's actually mainly been conducted by a colleague of mine, Rob Summers, who now works at TASO. So just to give him credit, and we're going to talk about some of the learning analytics work that we've been doing at Aston University. So the title of the talk is How You Teach and Who You Teach Both Matter, Lessons from Learning Analytics Data. So the general idea of learning analytics, you can identify up to 4 potential key benefits of learning analytics have been identified in the literature. The key one we want to talk about today is looking at potential attainment gaps and narrowing attainment gaps. But it can also be used to do things like improve quality of teaching and enable delivery of personalised learning. So prior to us starting this work, which was quite a few years ago now, we started this in about 2019, 2020, there was lots of literature that found relationships between engagement as measured by things like learning analytics and attainment, but they mainly did that at the end of the year, and very few studies kind of used live data as the term went on. So the ability of this data to actually predict somebody's performance or continuation was a little bit unclear. So whilst hindsight is a wonderful thing, we were interested in whether the system was powerful enough to actually predict attainment. So I'm just going to, it's got 2 for the price of 1 today, hopefully, so long as I don't run out of time. I'm going to outline 2 recent studies from Aston that have used learning analytics to look at different teaching and learning methods and the effect of those on engagement and on attainment. And we've partly used the pandemic period for this, which obviously caused different modes of teaching to be employed. And this is basically some studies of what happened during those different periods. So the first study I want to talk about is published already. So that's measures of engagement in the first 3 weeks of higher education, predict subsequent activity and attainment in first year undergraduate students. So the title kind of gives away the result, if you like, but what we were aiming to do here was to firstly examine the relationship between academic performance and the digital footprint over the course of the academic year. And secondly, to identify engagement activity that provided early predictive power of academic performance so that we could actually try and intervene and influence that in the future. So our study, this was 2019-20 academic year. We used just first year undergraduates, just home students, and we looked at only those students who actually did continue on to year 2, and that gave us a sample that year of 1,602 people to look at their data for. And we were using 6 feeds at Aston University at the time. So we were measuring things like VLE logins, so logins to our virtual learning environment Blackboard. We also looked at specific course accesses in Blackboard, as well as lecture attendance. So we had a lecture attendance monitoring system where students had to swipe in the actual lecture room. It's also policy at Aston to record all lectures so that students are able to watch them after, and we can look at to what extent people watch those lectures back, whether or not they'd actually been to the lecture. We also could look at assessment accesses and also the extent to which students checked library books out of the library. And we looked at this data on a weekly basis during the teaching weeks of the 2 semesters. And what we did was we divided the sample into mark quintiles according to the mark that they got at the end of the year. So we had quintiles 1 to 5, with quintile 1 being the students who had the lowest attainment at the end of the year, and quintile 5 being the students who had the highest attainment at the end of the year. And we could then look at to what extent the students in these different mark quintiles, different attainment quintiles, what their behaviour looked like in terms of our 6 feeds for the learning analytics data. And these are just violin plots of that data there. So you can see that although the quintile 5 students, the highest attaining students, do tend to be higher engagers on each of the 6 measures, there is actually a lot of overlap. So each individual measure individually is not actually that useful to predict the end of the year mark. You can see on the lecture attendance in the top right, the different quintiles probably do have a slightly different shape, with quintile 5 having a greater percentage of lecture attendance. But amongst the others, they are very, very mixed. So there is some pattern, but it's not particularly necessarily convincing or useful. What was interesting, though, is how consistent the performance was over time. So if we look at VLE course accesses, so access to our Blackboard system over the 2 teaching semesters, you can see that those in the higher mark quintile, so quintile 5, are consistently showing more engagement and more course accesses right across all of those weeks. And you can see that there's a pattern. So basically, engagement on this feed is definitely associated with attainment. And this was the case for nearly all the measures. So right across lecture attendance, assessment accesses, lecture capture system views, and general logins to our Blackboard system. So in each case, you can see that the higher attaining students in quintile 5 are showing the most engagement. A bit less consistency on library checkouts. That wasn't really consistent at all. In fact, probably not useful at all, and a bit of a mixed picture there, to say the least. So what we wanted to do was see whether we could look at VLE. We used VLE course accesses as a kind of general method for general metric, for engagement. We used this because it peaked early, so you can see that the quintiles already start to separate really well, even in the first 3 weeks of engagement. And what we did with this was we created engagement quintiles as well. And then we plotted engagement quintiles against mark quintiles to see how their behaviour differed and how that impacted on their marks. So you can see down the left-hand side, we've got the activity quintile. So the engagement quintile, the students fell in during the first 3 weeks. And across the top, we've got those activity quintiles from the last 3 teaching weeks. What I think is interesting here is that early engagement can be shown to be really critical. So for example, if in the first 3 teaching weeks you're showing a very low amount of engagement, students who show very low engagement, if they also show low engagement in the last 3 teaching weeks, their average mark would be 59.3%. If instead they last minute cram and go from the lowest quintile of engagement in the first 3 teaching weeks and up their activity just before the exam, i.e. last minute cramming, those students' marks only go up to about 61%. In contrast, if people are in the highest quintile in the first and the last 3 teaching weeks, their average mark would be 69.3%. So last minute cramming doesn't seem to be very effective, and in contrast, early engagement seems to be very critical. We then put some of this data into multiple regression to see which feeds and which student demographic factors were going to predict attainment best. So we just used 5 of the feeds for this because 2 of the learning analytics feeds correlated so highly that was the VLE logins and the VLA course accesses, that it would have caused problems of collinearity to keep both in. And we looked here at trying to use the data from just the first 3 weeks in one analysis, and then the data from the whole first year in the second analysis. And what we found was that in the first 3 weeks, you could predict 17.8% of the variance in mark. And what was interesting was that 12.1% of that variance could be predicted by the behaviour rather than the demographics. So for the demographics, we included sex, ethnicity, polar 4 quintile, and socioeconomic status. Ethnicity did predict attainment. That's the BME attainment gap that's so well publicised and we know about, and socioeconomic status. When we take into account data from the whole first year, you can predict 28.5% of the variance in marks from the whole first year, and a whole 23.4% of that is based on behaviour. So this is interesting in that it does back up previous research that's been published, I think, from Coventry University, suggesting that behaviour does outweigh demographics, and we don't need to use students' demographic data to try to use that to intervene, and because that's a potential stigmatization of students if we say, okay, because you're not white, we're gonna do some intervention to help your attainment. That's not really helpful. What is helpful is that you can look at someone's attainment and predict from their actual behaviour. So behaviour outweighed demographics there. So the conclusions we made from study 1 was firstly that early engagement really matters, and I think this kind of gives potential to intervene and ensure that everyone starts as they mean to go on. Some students can potentially flounder at the beginning of a new term, particularly in first year. So if you can put them on the right track early, it shows how important good induction can be, potentially. And secondly, that behaviour matters more than demographics. So there's no need to kind of try and predict someone's behaviour based on their demographics. We can actually do it based on behaviour. This colourful plot at the bottom is called a Sankey diagram, and it can show basically what it shows is how people in the different activity quintiles from lowest to highest, how they end up in different mark quintiles, with the thicker lines between the two being the majority of students. So you can see, for example, that the quintile 5, so the highest engaging students, there's a big thick line there to the mark quintile 5, the highest performing students. And you can also see that purple line at the bottom of quintile 5, you can see a very thin line to the quintile 1 mark quintile, i.e. very few students are going from a high activity quintile to a low mark quintile. So that was interesting. We then had the pandemic to contend with, and this basically gave us the opportunity to look at different teaching styles online versus in person. So obviously we had our in-person teaching and in-person assessment data from pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, because I think it started about Easter 2020, we had a mixed cohort who would have had teaching in person but assessment online. And then finally, the next year of the pandemic, we had both online teaching and assessment. And we were interested in particular to look at, there was a lot about digital poverty in the news at the time, and we wanted to see what the effect of moving online was on different student groups. And sadly, we did find, in terms of when we looked first of all, so that we've got those 3 different teaching modes along the bottom there: in-person teaching and assessment, in-person and online assessment, and both teaching and assessment online. And we looked at 2 groups of students. We split them by IMD quintiles, so that's the index of multiple deprivation. And the disadvantaged students, basically quintiles 1 and 2, and non-disadvantaged quintiles 3 to 5. And what we found was that the disadvantaged students were performing slightly lower in terms of their attainment in all 3 teaching conditions, but that pattern widened in the online only condition, and got quite wide there. And that's in terms of end of year mark. We found a similar pattern for how many students got all 120 credits they needed in their first year, in that in the online teaching condition, those widened out. And we looked at cluster analysis then to see how that changed with how the patterns of engagement changed under the different teaching conditions. And we found 3 clusters: high engagers, low engagers, and then people that only engaged in synchronous learning only. And we can see that the disadvantaged students did move more towards being in the low engagement group there. And it was the low engagement group, those students, particularly in disadvantaged groups, who showed low engagement, that were actually driving this difference in attainment. So it would seem that in terms of wanting to close gaps, firstly, we need to think about transition and induction and ways to engage students early. And secondly, we need to think about and monitor our different education strategies in terms of how they affect different groups. So whilst behaviour is more important than demographics, demographics can differentially affect behaviour in different teaching conditions. I'm hoping I've not overrun there, so thank you for listening, and I think we're taking questions at the end. Just stop sharing. Okay.
Stop sharing. Hi, that's great. Thanks. Thank you so much. That's really good, Liz, and really good running to time as well. Thank you. It's brilliant. So we're going to go on to down from Birmingham to Portsmouth now to Alex and Vladislav, and who's actually taking over here. We've got another screen share. Brilliant. Welcome. So what does simulations for the Office of Students B3 regs tell us about how fair and effectively it can identify areas below the specified thresholds? Fabulous. Over to you guys.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. So my name is Dr. Alexander Bradley, and my colleague is
Vladislav Pareshka, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Portsmouth.
Absolutely. And first, we'd like to begin by saying a big thank you to Society Research and Higher Education in funding this research. It would not be possible without them. Now, what I want to do over the next 20 minutes, or what we both want to do over the next 20 minutes, is to basically outline a little bit about the higher education context, to go into a little bit more detail about how we actually measure and then evaluate higher education, particularly in relation to their performance around graduate outcomes or that transition into the labour market. So I think all across the world, we've been in a really difficult place in terms of higher education. There's been a mass participation, so lots of students who are coming to study with us, which is fantastic, but it's also been at a time of low economic growth, and especially in the last couple of years, really high inflation. And this has led to this natural call for value for money for universities. And whilst we as higher education practitioners, we know how valuable university can be in terms of our students go on to become citizens who are more likely to volunteer, more likely to vote, more likely to engage in a healthier lifestyle, more likely to take their children out on educational experiences than if they hadn't gone to university. But all too often, this debate gets reduced down to a simple, are they professional, or are they employed, or what is their salary? So it gets reduced down to economic incentive. So what I want to do now is look at how different countries measure labour market outcomes or graduate outcomes, and then think about how policymakers use that data, because that data is never inert. Now, in essence, whatever you're going to do, there's always 2 broad approaches to collecting graduate outcomes and labour market data. One is administrative, so you can look at tax receipts, so you can look at welfare payments, and a good example of that in the UK would be looking at the longitudinal education outcomes data, which gives you salaries at 1, 3, and 5 years after students graduate. And then the other set of data is survey data. So in Australia, they have the graduate outcomes survey, which is conducted 6 months after students graduate. And in the UK, we have the graduate outcomes survey, which is conducted 15 months after students end their course. And within these surveys and within this administrative data, generally, there's a whole range of metrics you can use to look at labour market outcomes. You can look at unemployment rates. You can look at salary data. You can look at mismatches in qualifications or in skills. And you can also look at whether a job is professional or non-professional. So is it a teacher, a lawyer, a solicitor, or is it perhaps a barista, somebody pulling pints, somebody who's perhaps working as a care assistant? And we have different ways of looking at and trying to evaluate labour market outcomes, but the data is never in it. It's always used by governments to monitor the quality of, I guess, of higher education, and as they might see it from an economic point of view, to monitor their investment in the system. And also from a parents' and students' perspective, it's about what are they getting out of it. And it's often in that economic terms. And generally speaking, there's three broad approaches that can be used. There's information-based approaches, where you can give people data to labour market outcomes, and you can let prospective students and parents make up their own mind. You also have performance-based measures. So, for example, in Denmark, funding of 2% of performance-based funding is on unemployment rates at 12 and 23 months. And then finally, you have what I think we possibly adopted in the UK as a more punishments-based approach, which is where you set particular thresholds, and this is particularly in England with the Office for Students. You set particular thresholds, and then if you do not meet that threshold for graduate outcomes, for progression, then it will lead to investigations, and then it will lead to revoking of degree awarding powers or even fines. So really, really quite tangible punishments. Now, within the higher education context, as I mentioned, there is this graduate outcome survey, which has a response rate of around about 57%, and it has been falling over the last 4 years. And it's conducted 15 months after students graduate, and the Office for Students takes this data and calculates what we call a progression metrics. That's basically, is the student, if they're in positive progression, have they got some form of professional employment at 15 months? Are they in some form of further study? Are they retired, traveling, or caring? So all that counts as positive. Therefore, the only thing that counts as negative is if you're non-professional or unemployed. And what they tend to do is they tend to set thresholds, and thresholds vary by the mode and the level of the study. But to keep things simple, let's imagine for a UK full-time first-degree student, that threshold is 60%. But what we thought about was, when we're reading over this consultation, we're looking at the policy, is actually they've made decisions here, but it's not clear how effective those decisions are. So we're not entirely clear, because remember, you've got to remember, they are sampling from a population. So how accurate are they in actually capturing the true population value from that sample, especially if they've only got around about 55% or so that of students are actually responding? And what is the precision of those estimates? And that matters, because if you can precisely estimate the population value from this sample, then you can determine whether it's above or whether it's below a threshold. But what happens if, for example, you apply confidence intervals, and the confidence interval is actually quite wide, so there's a lack of precision? Then you can't actually identify courses that are under the threshold particularly well, because the confidence interval is so wide. And equally, you might have instances where you've sampled from a population that's actually above the threshold, but actually, they're actually, you know, they should be okay, but the sample's actually taking them from below the actual threshold and is saying that they're below standards. So these are things that we're going to look at in our simulations that allow us to quantify actually how much sampling error is there within their data. And equally, how important are those choices they make, about 90% to investigate a university or 95% to take regulatory action? You know, what about a 99% confidence interval? What difference would it make if we use that as a policy tool as well? And so this is where I'm going to pass over to Vlad, who's done some wonderful simulations and some graphics to help us dig into the details.
Thank you, Alex. So since our study's aim is to evaluate how efficient usage of the progression metric is, we relied on the power of the simulation technique to explore that. And the metric itself is practically the result of collection of survey data showing how universities' performance indicators compared to the thresholds established by the OFS. And therefore, we created synthetic data for a virtual population of providers, which in our simulation is repeatedly generated and sampled from under specific conditions and can be easily varied across specific factors. So to achieve that, the simulation procedure was conducted through data generation, referring to the provider's actual performance, then sampling of the data, mirroring the process of surveys and data collection to project the set performance. And finally, calculating statistics from each of the sample, which show how efficiently the metric can represent the actual performance and what are potential risks. Next slide, please. So during data generation, we varied two factors to create data sets describing providers' possible diverse situations. First, we used the different population sizes, which range from 40 up to 1,000 students and increased by 10 students each iteration. Consequently, we varied the percentage of graduates with the positive outcomes in each population, which went from 20% to 95% by increments of 5% each. Next slide, please. To execute sampling of the created data sets, we varied the percentage sampled, which corresponds to response rates in the surveys. That went from 30% minimum threshold set by the OFS to 90%, each time increasing by 5%. Sample sizes defining a number of students in individual sample has been included as well, and the process of sampling overall was then repeated 100 times for each of the variables and provided estimate points corresponding to survey results. However, due to potential imprecision of using singular estimation values of the surveys as a guideline to provide its performance, obviously the OFS deploy their confidence intervals instead as the measure of going below threshold. And that's why a particular attention was dedicated to this parameter. Next slide, please. So after the data was sampled, for the resultant estimation points, there were calculated confidence intervals, which has a distribution of statistical uncertainty around singular estimations as defined by the OFS. They're important for us because they essentially describe and showcase for different samples the probabilities that the population's true value of positive outcomes lies within the limits of confidence intervals. And for this reason, we calculated confidence intervals for each sample at 3 confidence levels, 90, 95, and 99%, to evaluate advantages and disadvantages, as Alex said, of choosing each one in varying circumstances. On this slide, we can see that 90% confidence interval, for example, is illustrated as a black bar, and yellow and red extension bars, of which refer to 95 and 99% levels, respectively. And in fact, the OFS uses diverse confidence levels as criteria for investigating. In particular, they undertake an assessment of compliance when around 90% confidence interval falls below the threshold. And they provide evidence for taking more intrusive regulatory action against an institution when an upper limit of 95% confidence interval doesn't manage to achieve the desired level. So the consequences of choosing different confidence levels and discovering how their respective usage can change the way the metric is approached has become the starting point of this research. Next slide, please. That's how, once all the necessary data of our virtual populations of providers and relevant statistics were simulated, we focused on 4 principal measures to analyze the progression metric we reproduced. So we have bias, coverage probability, precision, and also levels of false positive and false negative misclassifications. So we are going to delve into which is which and later pass to the results of our simulation regarding each of the measures. So the first one is bias, and that is a mismatch between sampled estimates and true population levels. And apparently the closer estimation point is to the real population level, and here of 50%, for example, the better. So in fact, as a result of random sampling on the image, we may see different rates of dispersion of sampled values from a population level of 50%. Secondly, we verified confidence intervals coverage probability, that is the probability that the interval estimated contains the true value as anticipated by its confidence level. At the same time, precision is the width numerical range of the confidence intervals, the extent of uncertainty the regulator may have around estimation point. And practically, if the range is too wide, it can impair the regulator's ability to distinguish those courses that lie below or above the threshold, since the regulator uses confidence intervals as a criterion of one's performance. Therefore, in analyzing that metric, 2 additional risk parameters were accounted for concerning the capacity to identify courses as lying below, false positive and false negative misclassifications. Next slide, please. False positive misclassifications in our study describe the cases when an upper limit, as you can see on the slide, of the confidence interval from a population with less than 60% with positive outcomes crosses the 60% threshold. And therefore, a university can have an underperforming course with 50% of positive outcomes, yet confidence intervals may fail to classify it with strong enough statistical evidence as below. And on this slide, you can observe a certain case of 100 estimates where 72 of which are false positives, like the highlighted one, since their confidence intervals cross the threshold. And so there could be not enough statistical certainty for the OFS to believe that a provider's underlying performance can indeed be negative. Consequently, the regulator may overlook such low-value courses. Next slide, please. And meanwhile, false negatives refer to the cases when a population level of positive outcomes is at or above the 60% threshold and so performing well in reality. But the sampled estimate in the upper limit of its respective confidence interval suggests the course is below this threshold, as you can observe one of the cases highlighted on the slide. In such a manner, due to sampling error, a university's course could be wrongly identified as underperforming and even prosecuted, when in fact the known level of positive outcomes was, for example, 65%, quite above this threshold. And so now I would like to present the results of our simulation, the statistical data produced by it regarding the performance of the metric. So first of all, we have bias, and the simulation showed that average levels of sampling bias roughly matched the true population levels. For example, the present tables show how the mean level of bias is very small for different response rates and sample sizes, indicating that sample estimates are in general very close to true population values across all levels of the percentage sampled. Nevertheless, to guarantee proper matrix performance, response rates and sample sizes ought to be as high as possible, thus lowering the probability of dispersion of the sample from the population level we can see through decreasing standard deviation numbers. Next slide, please. With what concerns statistical properties of confidence intervals themselves rather than sampling errors, this phenomenon of coverage probability was good across all three confidence levels, indicating that around indeed 99, 95, and 90% of the time respectively, the population level did indeed fall within the lower and upper bounds of confidence intervals in most samples, so irrespective of the sample size or percentage sample. Next slide, please. However, the precision of confidence intervals, their range, demonstrated to vary widely among diverse samples, depending on response rates, the number of respondents, and clearly confidence levels chosen. So the sample size appears to be a key factor, with samples below 100 having particularly wide interval widths, which apparently will reduce the OFS ability to accurately discern whether such smaller courses have met the 60% criteria. For example, here we see that sample size of 50 or less students at confidence intervals that had an average range ranging from 35% for the 99% confidence interval to 27% for 95 and 23% on average for the 90% confidence interval. So 12% difference between 99 and 90% confidence levels. And this difference of ranges across different confidence levels obviously can create an additional barrier in identifying correctly areas below the threshold if one confidence is preferred to others. Next slide, please. So when it came to the problem of effectively identifying courses below above the threshold, false positive misclassifications in particular, 90% confidence interval delivered better results in terms of prevention of false positive. And as can be intuited, 95 and 99 confidence intervals due to wider ranges of values will usually have a much greater likelihood of misclassifying courses as potentially above an established threshold, where the underlying performance is in reality below. And despite using a lower confidence level, we still see that the courses with true population levels closer to 60% threshold are especially prone to remain misidentified as underperforming. In fact, our simulation shows that using a low 90% confidence interval, the one which is set as the regulatory criterion, 45% of courses with 55% of positive outcomes will likely not be investigated. But setting a higher level, for example, 99%, instead means that more than 3/4 of courses would be classified as not having very strong statistical evidence of low performance. Next slide, please. So the graphic on the left shows that it is smaller sample sizes that lead to distinctively high rates of false positive misclassifications, which is particularly true for 99% confidence interval, while 90 and 95% measured at a much closer degree, although still with very high false positive rates. And low-performing courses having less than 100 students are under the substantial risk of being overlooked. In fact, more than half of courses with 45% of positive outcomes could not be properly evaluated even choosing 90% confidence level. And this amount of misclassifications grows up to 90% for courses just 5 points below the threshold. So the problem of false positive is especially pressing if we consider that the latest OFAS survey data from the 2017 to 2020 academic years showed that samples under 100 students, industries highest risks of false positives, comprised more than a half, 51% of all cases. And even by looking at the right graph, it can be seen that such considerable imprecision problem persists for low percentages sampled as well. And if we consider the service average response rate of 56, 57%, we can see that with 90% confidence level as a criterion, the OFAS won't have enough evidence for a half of courses with 55% in graduate outcomes to initiate investigation. All this illustrates that the regulator, by choosing the 90% confidence level as a criterion for launch investigation, should be able to more accurately discern courses as those below the threshold. This guarantees a greater degree of regulatory efficiency at the first stage of intervention. Next slide, please. At the same time, with regard to false negatives, the simulation allows us, the simulation allows us to see how if a course has a population level of positive outcomes at or right above the threshold of 60%, at the present state of regulation, by using 95% confidence interval as a criterion, the OFS would erroneously categorize 2% of courses as below the threshold and investigate, and take action against these courses. The number of completely misclassified courses would more than double if we use 90% confidence interval, but the statistical evidence could be made stronger by minimizing the impact of sampling error if the regulator selects 99% confidence interval. It decreases the risk of misclassification to mere 0.2%, and in such a manner, the OFS can have a lot more certainty when they take serious regulatory action, knowing that courses are genuinely below the threshold, as opposed to potentially below. And now I would like to pass the word to my colleague for conclusions.
So I'm aware we're out of time, so I'll be brief. As you can tell, fantastic job, Vladislav. Bias and coverage probability is fine. Precision is a little bit difficult, especially in small sample sizes, and false positives really increase with small sample sizes, and false negatives are an issue, especially if you're going to use 95% as opposed to 99%. So generally, we would recommend the OFS should use 99% for their taking strong regulatory action, as it will reduce false positives by around about 1.88%, which across the OFS data means there's probably about 9 institutions or 9 providers where they are being accused of being below the threshold, but actually wouldn't be. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry. Hi, thank you so much. Brilliant. That's a really grand run through a really complex set of data. And there's a whole set of people around the room saying, how do we get that paper and that information to the right people so that we can actually effectively have an impact on the way in which this data is looked at? It's such a frustrating data set for so many universities. So thank you for doing all that work. We'll come back to questions in a minute. If everybody's happy and Patrick's ready, we will zip across to Japan for our third presentation. Yeah, that looks like it's working. The successes and challenges of implementing assessment plans in Japanese higher education using student learning data. So not quite the same as the learning data from the UK, but the same principle. So absolutely great. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Pauline, and I hope everyone can hear me. I guess this evening or this morning, I'm joining you from the opposite side of the world, and perhaps also an opposite perspective, more of a sort of macro level, 30,000 feet view of how assessments are being implemented at a national level. Let me just give you a little bit of introduction of the Japanese context. Certainly similar to a learning approach emphasized by the Bologna process, Japanese higher education has emphasized the importance of articulating clear learning outcomes at the institutional academic program level. And this has been manifested most dramatically and most specifically in something called the 3 policies of Japanese higher education. I will mention and describe them in a moment, but it is in some ways probably the important through line of the entire talk. Initially, these policies were just more sort of informal ideas suggested by a consultative body of experts to the Ministry of Education, Culture, Science, Sports, and Technology, inexplicably abbreviated as MEXT. And the 3 policies has steadily become promoted as a central framework for how Japanese HE institutions should articulate and structure their education quality and mission. And indeed, by 2016, this was elevated as official policy in order to, quote, constantly reaffirm the university's own educational ideals and to serve as a starting point for a cycle of continuous self-reform and improvement. And I should actually, at this moment, mention that all red quotes are actually by my translation. So I take full responsibility for the translation's accuracy. So what exactly are these 3 policies? First, these 3 policies, it should be noted, were implemented exactly as the ministry was also asking universities to make explicit in writing their educational mission and ideals. The first policy is something called diploma policy that sets this, quote, the skills and capacities a given university or academic program based on the educational ideals aims to develop in a student, of which degree conferral represents the attainment of these educational goals. There is then a curriculum policy that sets out the educational content and methods of a curriculum and lays out the means of assessing learning outcomes for establishing whether the skills and capacities established by the diploma policy have been achieved. And finally, admissions policy which should set out the policies for admitting students who will endeavor to achieve the learning stipulated by the diploma policy and attain through the processes of the curriculum policy. As MEX states, these 3 policies should be based on educational ideals developed by the university. And in some ways, you could argue this is codifying a fitness for purpose approach to Japanese quality assurance. Given Japan's dramatic decline in college-age population and its relative decline in international reputation, it's certainly arguable that you can make the argument that this dramatic reform was needed in the Japanese higher education context. On the one hand, it could be seen as attempting to align institutional goals with explicit learning outcomes and establishing fundamental quality assurance best practices that are seen more broadly worldwide. And certainly you can see this in other overseas comparisons. And I should note that there are definitely backers of this approach within Japan to an outcomes-based education approach, the idea of making learning more visible. And I should mention one of the biggest proponents is actually my university professor, Hamana Atsushi, just for full disclosure. I should also notice that the 3 policies context is towards a broader thrust towards so-called education management in Japan, though it has come under criticism from other critics within Japanese higher education. Yanazawa Ariyoshi, for instance, notes that the thrust of these HE reforms could be seen as in line with the new public management trend seen in the UK and US, and certainly the actual language used in the policy documents refers to the implementation of PDCA cycle management processes and more business efficiency models, particularly promoted by Edward Deming in Japan. And certainly subsequent MEX documents have made the managerial and efficiency nature of these reforms explicit by asking HE institutions to place their 3 policies specifically in a way that, quote, establishes and enacts education based on the 3 policies as defined by each institution and assesses such educational outcomes through qualitative criteria or concrete implementation methods. This self-inspection and assessment is an important part of education reform and improvement, and through these kinds of necessary PDCA cycle approaches, universities, degree programs, and individual courses can each function efficiently. However, such top-down approaches have already been criticized in non-Japanese contexts, with some noting that an overemphasis on quality monitoring processes focused exclusively on performance and achievement can go without reflecting stakeholder experiences. Moreover, specifically in the Japanese context, scholars have argued that MPM models also obscure a much more top-down and state-initiated process where the Ministry of Education does play a large interventionist role. So this brings the context of today's research. The question arises, are current Japanese efforts in higher educational reform an attempt to bring the country in line with global learning and teaching practices, or is it part of an ongoing process of managerialization and centralization centered around the Ministry of Education? One possible way to get into this would be to look at a recent reception of such reforms on the ground, specifically in actual higher education institutions, and to see how these policies and changes are being realized on the ground. The very size of the three policies make it difficult to evaluate them in their entirety, but perhaps specific components of the policies could be possible to investigate, and this is, I guess, the rationale for the current survey. Specifically, in 2020, the ministry asked universities, as part of the establishment of their education management profile more generally, to implement something called assessment plans that, quote, it deemed, quote, necessary to the assessment and inspection of university educational outcomes through criteria such as rubrics and common program ways of thinking. The goal of these assessments and evaluations should conform to the institution's three policies and establish qualitative standards and concrete implementation methods, including those based on the use of institutional research to make learning outcomes visible. Therefore, understanding the extent and nature of Japanese HEI higher education institution implementations of these MEX-directed assessment plans is a promising first glimpse into grasping the larger evolution and efficacy of this approach to Japanese higher education reform. One caveat, before discussing the research survey itself, I should take this opportunity to note that Japan is dominated by a wide array of HE types, particularly smaller private as well as proprietary institutions that might have a slightly different character than UK higher education. In both numbers and enrollment, only about 30% of Japanese higher education institutions are the better known national and public institutions such as Tokyo or Kyoto University. And given that three policy reforms project is based on a fitness of purpose approach, this survey as well was very conscious of the fact that assessment might not be fixed on a concept, on a rigid set of criteria. Certainly, the University of Tokyo would be very different than the assessment needs would be very different than those in a small tuition-dependent family-owned school. And therefore, analyzing assessment practices of both research-oriented and national universities, as well as community-oriented municipal and prefecture universities and tuition-dependent private universities might provide insight in how institutional imperatives and QA interact in complex ways. So the immediate goal of the survey is also to divide up these assessment plans by institutional type. Okay, let's actually take a look now at the survey itself. This research was conducted as a nationwide survey of accredited four-year Japanese universities during 2022 and 2023. It was an online survey questionnaire sent to the academic affairs vice presidents of all 787 accredited four-year institutions. The survey goal was to inventory at a national level both the assessment content of these plans and to explore how such data is used institutionally within the Japanese higher education in practice. The result was a 30.5% response rate, and approximately 71% of the responses came from private institutions, with the remaining surveys coming equally from national and municipal prefectural universities. In terms of Japan's current institutional type breakdown, this is more or less consistent with current ratios, with about 77% of four-year universities being from generally smaller, less well-funded private institutions, and about 12 to 11% in the various public university categories. If anything, the response was probably a little bit larger and weighted more towards the better funded national and public universities. First, in terms of results, 2/3 of respondent universities reported that they had adopted assessment plans at their institutions, suggesting that a relatively widespread adoption at the national level. As you can see here, the key point will be highlighted in yellow. Nonetheless, challenges inhibiting the effectiveness of these assessment plans were visible. Only 14% of university vice presidents who implemented such plans said that their assessment data was, quote, often used by their organizations. Additionally, only 24% of these universities reported, quote, regularly auditing their assessment plans, raising the possibility of assessment plans becoming routinized and losing their original dynamism or reform intention. Interesting, the specific content of assessment varied by institution type. The indices most used by private schools, for example, were enrollee satisfaction scores and job placement performance, versus a much lower rate among national universities. Along the same lines, private school assessment plans were nearly twice as likely as national universities to use third-party credentials and qualification schemes to demonstrate learning attainment. While in contrast, national universities' most popular assessment indices were the attainment of learning outcomes as defined by their own academic programs, 68% for national universities versus 51% for private ones. I guess what we can see is that survey results likewise suggest that the meaning and function did differ greatly by institutional category. National universities appear to approach these plans as longer-term tools of curricular reflection, while private institutions seem to use plans as more immediate external feedback mechanisms to gauge student satisfaction and performance. I guess you could contrast these as a reflective orientation of national universities and more of a consumer satisfaction emphasis of private schools. And in contrast, 40% of national universities were regularly auditing their assessment plans, as opposed to only 22% of private universities doing likewise. I do want to spend a little time talking about the free responses, which in some ways I think are probably the more rich and certainly qualitative aspect of it. Admittedly, the response rates here were even less. It was only 13% of responses overall. Generally speaking, there was a little bit centered on specifically the sort of plan itself. Much more was centered on the method of the plan, how to concretely gather and analyze data. These are, again, from the academic vice presidents responding, how to systematize assessment indices, and how to raise the quality of assessments and verify the validity of these assessments. There was also some comment centered on the application of the plan. And as I'll get to in a moment, the biggest source of criticism actually came from comments on the practical application of the plan, how much faculty actually might understand the results, how to avoid assessment formalism, and how to ensure continuous effectiveness, and how to overcome issues of insufficient human resources who can actually analyze and promote the results of these assessments as well. Overall, it seems as though the results regarding the opinions of an institution's assessment plans reveals a general engagement with the assessment plan in general, at least among some, a desire to make it work, although only one comment, the last that I'll introduce, was explicitly positive. Comments included, quote, our university implemented its assessment policy in 2022, but the topic of how to measure and assess in a systematic way and how to make learning outcomes tangible remain an issue. It feels difficult to set criteria to revise our assessment plan. What evidence should be used to affect such reform? To begin with, one can surmise that the necessity for revising the plan will come from the data collected by our institutional research office. And finally, one, over the course of verifying our 3 policies, we can conduct our PDCA cycle and be able to evaluate our assessment policy. 2, by publicizing our assessment results, students can be reassured in their learning. I guess as to be expected from a newly implemented initiative, many Japanese university administrators seem to be genuinely addressing the issues of assessment, but technical challenges remain. In the last couple of minutes, let me just also highlight, I would say about a third of the free responses responded with deeper skepticism about the viability of these plans. Comments range from mildly critical to explicitly negative. Quote, although the assessment plan framework has been introduced, it is difficult to continue substantiating it. There is a fear of it being reduced to a formality. The goal seems to be becoming the implementation of the assessment plan itself. It feels as though the educational revisions that would use such results are being left behind or being forgotten. And from this significant but minority opinion, it does appear as though some administrators remain passively negative towards the initiative, perhaps reflecting some feelings that the assessment plans are MEX-led top-down processes. And I should mention, it is also important to remember that these surveys were filled out by academic vice presidents or the representatives, so the opinions can be said to reflect upper administration's viewpoints of assessment plans. And yeah, I guess hopefully there will be a follow-up investigation to explore these ideas more generally. In conclusion, given that the government has promoted institutional level assessment plans for only a few years, one could argue that the overall adoption rate within Japanese higher education is impressive in both the overall percentage of adoption and the diversity of its uses. Assessment plans do seem premised on a fitness for purpose approach. It appears as though MEX-initiated reforms have been accepted by many HEIs. Many free responses indicate that there is active engagement with these plans, although they do present their own practical issues. At the same time, a sizable minority remain broadly skeptical of the assessment plan's viability, suggesting that MEX might need to do more to assure higher education institutions that it's not simply another top-down bureaucratic exercise. Moreover, from a technical standpoint, challenges remain both with regards to how the data is used and the frequency with which assessment indices are themselves reevaluated and revised. And finally, more attention must be paid to how institutional category type informs the adoption of assessment plans, as the nature of these plans appear to vary greatly between private and national institutions. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion following.
Super, thank you very much. Thank you, Patrick. That's really clear. It's really fascinating to see what's happening in Japan, because it follows some time after things have happened in 1 or 2 other countries, but literally going down a lot of very familiar arguments here. Can I, we're a relatively small group, can I invite everybody to turn on their cameras, and we have time. Hi, Rob. We have time for a discussion. We have plenty of time for a discussion, which is lovely. So thank you so much to all our speakers. So where should we start? Should we start, Liz? Should we start with you? Liz, I really enjoyed I'll start because I'm here now and other people are coming in. I mean, I really enjoyed what you were saying. One of the things I'm really interested in, I'm really interested to hear what other people have to say as well, is having done all this really interesting analysis, and I think it was the first time I'd ever seen somebody get data on the effectiveness of cramming. I don't think anybody's ever done any research or actual numbers on the effectiveness of cramming. Oh, that was really interesting. How do we actually use this data? How do we show it to the incoming students so that it begins to have an impact on behavior? How do we actually take this sort of interesting analysis and then cause it to make a difference? Have you had any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because there's always the lecturer who shows the correlation between engagement and attainment at the beginning, and kind of puts it over to the students, says, so you kind of better come to lectures, etc. I try to take a more sort of non-student deficit model, and I like to think it's more up to us to make it engaging and make sure people know what they're doing at the beginning of term, if you like, to particularly for disadvantaged students, if they might be first in family, they might not know they're supposed to be doing extra reading and extra things outside. So I like to take the approach that it's up to us to increase engagement rather than just by saying, look at this kind of correlation. So, but I do think it's underscored the kind of importance of a good induction. Yeah, so I think we're trying to use that at Aston as best we can. Certainly in my college, we've tried to use that as a but yeah, I think showing students the correlation, I think it's kind of been done before, and I'm not sure it necessarily has that much impact, but I'd be interested to see what other people think.
Other thoughts and other points?
I'd be happy to come in there. I do think there is something in that setting of expectations and standards. So, for example, during the pandemic, I was asked to do a talk to, I think it was like American University on some web scraping kind of techniques I'd used. And admittedly, they were PhD students, so they are kind of the more motivated, committed students. But because they had a policy there of having cameras on from the beginning, or had that policy of like engagement at the beginning, I think if it was used in the VC address, or was used at the head of school address, I think it would set that standard there to then get students to actually focus on actually, like, if I want this, I have to work for it. And perhaps would get away from more of, I guess, because the other way of looking at it as well as a student deficit model, but another way could be to think about it in terms of a sense of, are we just servicing the consumer needs, and is that what we should be doing? Should we be setting standards? Does it lead to their falling academic standards? So sometimes we feel like when we marking essays and we give them a first, we're actually like, well, would we have given them first 5 or 10 years ago? So I'm not sure if maybe that is another point to add to that mix.
I think there's also the point about whether this is best done in the, there's obviously the setting the first pace for the first 3 weeks, but there's also reminding people about it 5 and 6 weeks in, or having ways in which this sort of data is just displayed in the library, or displayed in the Students' Union, or displayed in other places, so that so it provides some sort of prompt and reminder as well.
I mean, the other thing that's kind of coming in fashion is kind of the idea of block teaching at the moment. And if you miss the first few weeks of any block teaching, you're really in trouble. But maybe that's something that keeps people's motivation up. I guess that will need evaluating as well.
It will. I'm throwing the floor open. Yeah, Patrick?
Sorry, just actually one comment. And I actually had to briefly step out at the beginning of Liz's presentation. So if you cover this, my apologies. I know the idea of engagement, particularly in Purdue University, they about 10 or 15 years ago had something called the Signals program that used the LMS and sort of student logins as a way to monitor. Yeah, how do you feel about sort of going from encouraging sort of engagement to the actual sort of monitoring sort of model adopted, I guess, in some US institutions?
Yeah, so our students were monitored as part of this, but in the first year the data weren't particularly used. So the students had access to their own data, but they weren't used for anything from a staff point of view. So that's quite interesting in itself, because usually when people put learning analytics systems, they have a kind of big bang approach, and they have the interventions there as well. We just kind of sat back and watched for the first year, which I think is quite interesting. But whether there was any effect of the students being able to see their own data in terms of sort of gamification of success, I don't know. They were probably, let's be honest, I mean, it's not a perfect data set. They were probably swiping each other in and all sorts of things. It's not a perfectly accurate representation of true engagement, I wouldn't say. But it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of useful. And I think it's useful in terms of kind of quality of education. So is there a type of module people are more likely to engage with and more likely to attend? I think it tells us something about our own teaching as well. And I think that's a really useful way. But yeah, in terms of monitoring the ethics of it, I've got to admit, I wasn't kind of on that side of it myself. It wasn't me who implemented the system. I was asked to evaluate it. But yeah, just possibly change behaviour.
Good, thank you. Rob, I think you had a question for Alex and Vlad, I think.
Yes, Alex has just responded. Actually, I mean, I was just it was early on in the conversation, and obviously Vladislav then bore out more or less what I was sort of hinting at. I've no idea what aggregation level 3 means, but obviously it's comparatively large. But I mean, I'm fairly skeptical in general about how and why the OFS chooses to put boots on the ground, as it were, to use their phrase, and I think that's to a certain extent been borne out by the first set of investigations. But I mean, a question to Alex, really, I guess. I mean, I think this is very useful and important stuff, and so I'm really glad you're doing the research. But actually, I almost thought at times the OFS could do better by just looking at the 2 or 3 absolute outliers in terms of the overall distribution and just talking to them rather than, I mean, this analysis is cheap and free presumably for OFS, so they don't have to put much effort in, but actually it's not adding much value in terms of what they're actually likely to want to look at, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think there's lots of really interesting points to unpack there. Like, it's certainly unclear as to how they actually. So at the beginning of each kind of year, they have some what they call prioritization mechanisms, which is basically where they seem to look for areas, although it's not really clear what actual kind of policies or directions they're actually using. They seem to look for areas that have large dispersions within the data. So, for example, this year, other degrees are being looked at, foundation years and business courses, because presumably they've looked at those particular areas of provision, and they seem to have really large variability in their outcomes and often more likely to be below the threshold at a kind of sector level. In terms of like what I worry about in terms of how this data is used internally at institutions, is I've had senior leaders heard of senior leaders talking about and pointing to courses saying these courses are failing, and actually their sample estimates are actually at the 60% level or just slightly above, at which point they are not failing in terms of the OFS, in terms of investigation on the ground, or indeed in terms of actual taking financial implications, statutory measures against them. And I think there is that lack of understanding about how the competence intervals are applied. But I would also suggest that one of the things I think is useful about this is when you think about the, just from a wider context, from an EU context, they are introducing in 2025 the graduate tracking survey, where all members of the EHE or the European wider higher education area are actually going to be implementing some sort of graduate survey. And so therefore, whenever data is collected, it's not going to be inert. So it's also like, will they also choose to take a similar sort of threshold approach? And I think the threshold approach is what we're showing with these simulations is quite flawed, because it's actually very difficult to identify things that are actually genuinely below. And it's also quite difficult to identify things that are actually above or just on the threshold. And so I think that kind of approach to regulation is what we're kind of poking at. And also just highlighting to people, if you use simulations like we're doing, as you say, it's a free approach, and it can allow you to think about, okay, you're using a certain kind of competence, or these are Jeffrey's competence, or which is for binomial distributions. There are other ones available. What is the choice? What's the difference in the trade-offs and the choices you're making? When you look at 90% versus 95%, why not 99%? Because what they've opened themselves up to is sampling error. And as we show, there's bound to be 9 or so thresholds that they're highlighting, which actually they are above the threshold, they're above standard. But because they've just not chosen the right competence interval, they've gone for a lower level, they could be a line for regulatory action against them. And that would be of no fault of the provider, it's purely just due to sampling error. And we haven't even accounted for what is obviously also going to be an issue, which is as well, as we know with measurement, there's sampling error, but then there's also measurement error. And you can have issues with measurement error. So we know, for example, when you look at SOC coding and you look at the value, HES's validations of its own SOC coding, there's around about 5% error there as well. So there's both, and that would also muddy the actual thresholds in the implementation of the thresholds. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, to summarize, is that it's a really interesting way of doing regulation of higher education outcomes, but it has challenges, and simulations allow you to identify what the different trade-offs are in the 1995 and 99. And then I do have concerns about how that data is used internally, because I think there's a lack of understanding there.
Yes, I mean, my experience is lack of understanding at every level, and failure to appreciate counter arguments when they're put in the terms that you're putting them, Alex, as well. And that's even before you get into, well, define a course for me, which is not something that is at all straightforward, which is not something that anybody outside HE actually appreciates. But but what is every individual student probably has a unique experience in terms of their course. So so what exactly are we evaluating is the question. Which isn't to say that this is really worthwhile research. You know, I'm absolutely all for it, but it has huge definitional difficulties as well.
There is that difficulty in feeding back results of this research to the OFS and other bodies. In a sense, your phrase, if you're going to make an impact with those people, it's getting it onto one side and one headline. And if your one side title said, these are the 3 institutions that need looking at and none of the others do, you're actually kind of driving things in the right direction without presenting government with a huge amount of statistics that they're going to look half a look at and not bother to look at properly. It's quite interesting trying to find, sorry, it's really back to the point about trying to find angles that will have impact.
Yeah, on that note, so Wonky, something I remember you mentioned Wonkies in terms of an outlet that they do use for policy making. I think Nicola mentioned that, didn't she? And that's something we do plan to do. But I also know, and as I'm sure lots of people do, who are UK focused, Charlie Ball as well. And he said that he'll have a look at the report and pass that on to people he knows who actually in the OFS who actually are responsible for this. That's something else we plan to do as well. We'll have, as you rightly say, we'll have to write something which is not a journal article or paper, but actually something much more simple policy sort of briefing to get the points across, and hopefully we'll maybe see some movement in the right directions. Yeah.
And then that's 2 entries on your CV. You've got the policy one and the paper as well. So that's good. Great. Comments for Patrick. I mean, it's really interesting to hear about what's going on in Japan and just how much it reflects things happening elsewhere. Rob, did you have a comment?
Well, I can always manufacture one, Pauline. No. What struck me about Patrick's presentation is how very similar it sounded to every national policy context I've ever been in. And the skepticism in the institutions about the policy, and therefore it contradicts some of the cultural stereotypes in this country about Japanese rather than American or British sort of approaches to things. And so that was what struck me most. I think there is obviously at every level in every national policy system some translation of the policy until when it gets down to institutional level and below, sometimes the policy may be very, very different. And that perhaps partly explains why the larger, more public institutions in Japan are, if you like, sounds as if they're complying more, but maybe that's only a function of size as much as anything else. You know, the smaller private institutions may not be taking much notice, but that's because they're small and therefore they're more in tune, as it were, at the management level, the senior management level, with what's actually going on the ground, and that's what they're more concerned with. But I'm merely kind of speculating off the cuff.
Yeah, I think, Rob, so first the point about the sort of across institutional types is a really interesting one. And maybe my understanding of the UK higher education landscape is in error. Japan is very much dominated by actually smaller, oftentimes proprietary institutions, not the kind of big like University of Phoenix types that you see in the United States, but literally more sort of mom and pop shops, or more family owned institutions. And I do think one of the really interesting things about this 3 policy approach is, I think in one way, they're more actively engaged, whether they're more authentically sort of invested. I guess it's a different conversation, and maybe one of the questions to explore more. I mean, I do think that in some ways there's a narrowness to how national universities are responding to assessment plans. But I would note that sort of it is actually the national universities that seem to be the only are the ones that are much more at I think at a 2% rate actually going back and interrogating, are our assessment indicators really the right indicators, where it seems like maybe smaller private institutions are just, they need something to sort of demonstrate that they're doing something good, maybe even as much for promotional purposes, and just sort of going from there. But I guess the cause and effect could be teased out in a lot of different ways.
I guess there's, if I reflected back to the way in which this sort of oversight of assessment came in the UK, yes, it was often adopted in the big national universities, but although it had been adopted at university level, it took quite a few years before the individual departments actually got round to making things happen in quite the way the institution said it did. And in some cases, probably quite a long time before one or two departments finally got round to getting, as it were, on board with the strategy. So I don't know if that's happening in Japan as well. It's just the filter factor through the big universities to departments that see themselves as autonomous within they may be within the university, but see themselves as having that autonomy over what and how they work. That certainly was something that put a delay into the UK system, I think right across the UK in the 1990s, early 2000s. So that may be part of the picture in the larger universities, but certainly in somewhere like, because there are small scale institutions in this country, the conservatoires or the Institute for Pharmacy, that are very specialist, and they can actually implement things very quickly because they have relatively small number of degrees and it's very focused. I think there was a comment from Ruth. Ruth, you had a comment really saying, and where next? I think Ruth, if I paraphrase your comment, it was where do you take this next? And I think, Patrick, my question to you is what's next on the agenda with this research, because it's great for us to hear about what's happening in Japan, and really love to hear you following up on this.
First, I should note my co-author, Professor Hayashi, is also in the audience, so I would defer to him if he has some comments on this as well. But yeah, I think that actually first, Pauline, your point about sort of how this is translating out at the departmental level is an important one. And in fact, one of our sort of sub-research projects is actually looking at Japan's sort of incorporation, or at least benchmarking, to UK quality assurance practices at the department level as well. In fact, we're going to be spending a few days at the University of Newcastle in early January. Maybe not the best time to visit the UK, but yeah, we hope it'll be a profitable journey as well. But also, I think one of the things we've been exploring, and hopefully we'll be sort of moving forward with, is a survey more from the student stakeholder and how that is being played out. We've heard from academic vice presidents. I think it's a good first step. Certainly, anytime you embark on a nationwide survey, it's always a huge undertaking. But I think we're also feeling that there are probably other avenues to approach as well.
Excellent, thank you. Alex, did you, sorry, Alex, I've just seen you put something up. Do you want to?
Yeah, no, I've got two questions actually, one for Patrick and then one for Liz. Patrick, excuse my ignorance. I was wondering from what is the regulatory kind of consequences of not engaging with the policy? Because if there is something going on, you don't have to do it, but it's obviously quite burdensome and time consuming of staff to implement the assessment kind of policies that they're requiring. What is the cost if they don't do it? How would anybody know? And then following on from that, a recent UK report, I think it was, showed that in the UK about 11 university staff on average are kind of hired just to deal with regulatory burden. Do you know what the costs are in Japan and what the costs of this policy are? And then my question to Liz is about whether you've used your learning and engagement data to actually predict dropouts, and how important, especially that is, given the B3 progress continuation metric. And if you haven't used it, what have you learned? But over to you, Patrick.
First, with regards to sort of, I guess, the stick that the government can hold over institutions. So here I have to admit some embarrassment. So my understanding is it's not like either in the UK with the funding agencies or funding bodies, or the UK with basically student loan support. I know that the three policies came in sort of in waves, sort of first as suggestions. My understanding now is there is a mechanism of compliance. Maybe I might need to defer to Professor Hayashi on the specifics. Certainly there are means of, there are ways that the government can exert leverage over funding, over student specific tuition support. But yeah, the specifics of that, I think I might have to defer to others on that.
Thank you. And Liz, do you want to comment?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Alexander. Yes, we did try to look at continuation. So I guess partly this is the problem of trying to publish null results because nobody finds them very interesting. We did struggle to predict continuation. It's interesting that in a lot of the studies in the literature, this is why it's interesting to look at live data rather than data from the end of the year, because people will tell you they can look at learning analytics data and predict who's dropped out. Well, they can at the end of the year because that person probably hasn't been there for half the year. So, but that's not particularly useful. So we could predict that retrospectively, but it has no use to anybody. We struggled to predict continuation with it, to be perfectly honest. Statistically, it's quite difficult when it's a rare event you're trying to predict because the amount of people that drop out is so small. It's actually quite difficult. Aston has, touch wood, and remains to have quite a high continuation rate. So I think ours is 95, 96%. So you're trying to predict a very small number of people dropping out. So no, in all honesty, we did not have a lot of success at using it for that, with the extent of being able to do it at the end of the year when they've already dropped out, which is no use.
Yeah, I wondered if that might be the case. I have a similar issue with unemployment rates, predicting unemployment. Again, it's quite a small, unlikely event. So actually trying to predict is kind of challenging. Yeah, but,
but nobody wants to read about null results. I wish they did. Life would probably be a lot more straightforward because then other people wouldn't need to try it. And but yeah, that's the honest answer. Tried and failed.
Okay, Rob, you have a last question, I think, for everybody.
Oh yes, sorry. I think if people have seen it in the chat, I mean, I think the lesson, and Aston looks like a very honourable exception, and no doubt other institutions sometimes can claim the same. Most institutions aren't using the data they have in a way that they easily could, and that's the same is true of government agencies as well. I think you often find, I mean, Alex, you may find when you contact the OFS that the stats people are absolutely ace. And mostly their colleagues don't listen to them or don't listen to them anything like enough. And I just wondered how we might address that. I mean, Liz, you're right that nobody, well, sadly, that's probably true that nobody wants to read sort of null results. But actually, what you've done, I think, is fascinating and very important. And everybody ought to be doing it as a matter of routine. But the question is, how do we get to that point? You know, I mean, I think there is a, you know, without addressing the national problem of illiteracy and statistics, that is, you know.
Oh gosh, yeah. I've got to be honest. So for our data, Solution Path were our provider, and the raw data was not good enough to predict. We have applied various statistical tricks, if you like, or extra analyses to get it to that point. In terms of the next steps and actually using the data, I think the answer's got to be in terms of intervening and seeing whether we can use the data live to actually intervene to, I guess, improve students' engagement or predict when they might be about to drop out and maybe provide that extra little bit of support, or to help close attainment gaps, or maybe to change the way we're teaching, or to change the way we're inducting students. But I think you're right in that, yeah, change is slow. So just because I might publish a paper or some analysis, it doesn't mean that everyone takes notice and changes their practice straight away, even internally. So I'll keep knocking on that door. But yeah, gradually we'll get there. But I wouldn't suggest everybody tries to do everything. Personally, I'd like to see more, I guess, larger studies, national studies, sharing data, getting more generalization. I think that's probably the way to go, rather than each institution doing this kind of work individually. Be nice to generalize more across different types of universities. That would be my dream.
Thank you, Liz. Last words from Alex or Patrick?
Yeah, from my perspective on that point, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a question of our time. So there's just so much data there in so many different ways. And I think certainly from an institutional point of view, we'll need obviously university executive board backing, as with anything. And I think if they, and I think it's a logical answer. I think some universities must get to at some point, because it is a win-win for them in terms of the TEF statements, as we've recently seen submitted. To set up, I would say, like a research, almost like a research network or research theme, which basically puts together, and this is the crucial part, puts together people from the student record management system who can have access to the system, and allow them to create basically with academics and connects them in a forum to allow the academics to basically think about the kinds of questions they're interested in, whether it's being student engagement, whether it be in employability, whether it be in learning analytics and addressing the inequality gap, and then actually with them, with IT or with the student records people, actually then generating reports, and allows the academics to get the data they need out of the systems they have access to. And I think that's something that could be, again, almost like set up either within a research theme, or even, remember David Cameron had that nudge unit where they had behavioural insights, and that again could be something that a university sets up to try and do. And again, it'd be win-win, because it'd be good for the university. They would learn from what they're doing, so they'd learn, actually, we've done placements, what impact do placements have, even when you control for degree classification and all these other things. And so it allows us to actually, because I don't know about you, but often I find in higher education or in universities, if you've been around long enough, you'll see the same policy coming back round 5 years later, but you still won't know if the policy worked 5 years ago or if it's going to work now, because no one's ever bothered to look at it, because they never bothered to join up to the data that's available to them. And that's why I think that a smart university will take those steps in the future, but it will require evidence-based and a commitment from UEB and the people involved. And there's benefits both to the academics in terms of getting papers, but there's also benefits to the institution in terms of learning from that. But it'll be a smart institution that does that.
Thank you. Yeah, excellent point. Patrick, did you want to have a last word?
First, just to answer Alex's point, Professor Hayashi did mention, so non-compliance does affect accreditation, and it is now a process that there is a multi-year accreditation process, so that there can be negative consequences there. It's not a direct monetary, I guess, sanction, however. I guess, and also I would just say, if anyone is in Japan, feel free. Me and my co-authors are all located in very scenic areas. Thank you very much, Phil.
Thank you. That's absolutely fabulous. Thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you to all our presenters, Liz, Alexander, Vladislav, and Patrick, for brilliant, very clear, on time and presentations, and a really good discussion to follow that brings together those three themes about managing the data and trying to get to the next level. And thanks to Rob, Ruth, Camille, and Toru, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us and discussing the papers. So we have a break now till the next set of sessions, which start at 11:45. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Pauline.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks.